Good morning, everyone. Third year priest and rabbi class. Little bit different this year. Aaron Bisno, who's with us as the rabbi in residence, now has a job that will take him away some Sundays, but most of them he will be here. Can you hear him? Everybody hear me okay? I have my church voice just kicks in. What's that?
There's an echo.
There's an echo. Okay.
Well, we hear you twice. I guess that's all.
Oh, well, yeah, exactly. Today we have a special guest, and that is Deanna Briody, who is our curate. What is a curate? If you're ever on Jeopardy and you get this question, you'll thank me. What is a curate? Somebody who needs to be cured. Well said, Judy. It's for an old-fashioned English term, which really means cure of souls, care of souls. And traditionally, within the Episcopal Church of England tradition, it's a title given to somebody newly ordained. Think of it as a type of apprenticeship. Yes, of course, she has a lot to offer, but she also has things to learn. And it's usually over the first year or two. Generally speaking, in America, she would be called the assistant rector or associate rector in the future. But Deanna has been here as our intern for 2.5 years, as a McNulty intern, so is well known to most of us. And she will talk about some of the call that she's discerned, how to live out her priesthood. In our tradition, you're ordained a deacon in a transitional state, to become a priest 6 or 12 months later. I just confirmed this week that Deanna will be ordained a priest at Calvary Church solo instead of 4 ordinations like for the diaconate last time. Each of the 4 people will be ordained in their own congregation. So Deanna will be ordained by herself here at Calvary Church on Saturday, January 11th. Don't know the time. It's wonderful to work with her. I will also say yesterday we did a wedding together, and she was the preacher. I would say that's probably the finest wedding sermon I've ever heard. And the first line was unbelievably good. What was that? Marriage is about love. I know, right? Really original, she said. And then it was really quite wonderful, so thank you for that. Preview, so today is this week, Deanna talking about Incarnation, where it comes from. Please ask questions anytime, raise your hand. The next 3 weeks, so weeks 2, 3, and 4, Aaron Bisno and I will be talking about the Jewish high holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which are about to happen, and we will host Tree of Life again. And then I wouldn't say they're counterparts, but roughly analogous to some of the ideas within those 2 high holidays of a Jewish New Year. There is also a sense of repentance, forgiveness, atonement, and how that is somewhat like Easter, and how these ideas compare, contrast, because there aren't exact equivalents of all of that together between the 2 traditions. A little later, we'll talk about Psalms together, and then something I'm really looking forward to is in November, looking into the season of Advent, specifically what we expect in Advent. And very briefly, Advent's about what? How'd you do in confirmation class? What's the purpose of Advent? What do we talk about, the theme? Preparation for what? Oh, I got a good answer from the curate. Most of the focus, at least how we think about it culturally, church-wise, is the first coming of Jesus and the Incarnation at Christmas. But it's just as much about the second coming, the return in glory, Christ the King, the creation redeemed, renewed, all of those things together. And what we're going to talk about specifically in the class, Aaron and I, is why don't the Jews have the same understanding of the Messiah as the Christians? Because in their tradition, the Messiah will come and usher in the Messianic age, which is the rough equivalent of the kingdom of God. So we'll talk about what does that idea of the Messiah mean, and what does this kingdom Messianic age look like, and how does this Advent, that is, looking for the Messiah, how does that play into it. So that'll be November. We'll have Psalms in November, and then a variety of things like that throughout the year. Any questions before we start? Deanna Briody, please come up.
And as people come in, just usher them this way toward seats. There's plenty of chairs over here. So I'm here today to talk about Church of the Incarnation. If I haven't met you, my name is Deanna, but I feel like I know most of the people here. And I'm here to talk about Church of the Incarnation, which is the new congregation that Calvary is planting in Beaver County. And Lord willing, I will serve as the priest of that new congregation. Before I dive in to that topic, I do want to say that this is not a goodbye tour, okay? I'm going to still be here at Calvary. First of all, we're not going to be meeting weekly for about a year and a half, probably, with Incarnation. But then when we do start meeting, our hope is to meet on Saturday evenings, which will allow me to be present on the preaching rota here. And of course, it will change shape a little bit, my presence here, but I'll be able to still really be a part of this community. So that's great news. So I thought the best way to share about Incarnation is to tell a little bit about my story and how I came to be here in Western Pennsylvania and came to first discern a call to the priesthood, and then how that's taken shape over the past many years, bringing us to today where we're trying to start a new church. So I grew up in New York. I was a big Roman Catholic family, Irish Italian, very loud, just everything you would picture. And I came to Beaver County to attend Geneva College when I was 17. And you might ask, why was I attending Geneva College? What brought me out to Geneva? That's a good question. I got recruited to play volleyball there. That's probably a twist for many of you. You don't know that part of my life, but I got recruited to play volleyball. I'm quite short. I was really wanting to play volleyball in school. I didn't have a ton of options, and I wound up here in Western PA. So Irish, Italian, Roman Catholic kid with a New York accent and liberal leanings, and I showed up at one of the most conservative Presbyterian schools in the country without much preparation, nestled in an old steel town on the border between Pennsylvania and Ohio. I'll just let that sit for a moment. There was some serious culture shock with that transition. It was a tumultuous time, and if you ever want to hear stories, I'll tell them in another context. I definitely have some good ones. But even amidst the extreme culture shock and the real spiritual tumult that came with it, because it really was a confusing transition in a lot of ways, I really loved it here. I loved it here from the start. I loved Beaver County. If you read the Agape article from this month that I wrote, you've already heard me wax eloquent about my first drive down Route 18 and just falling in love with the hills and the creeks and the rivers and the bridges and the old factories and the way that this place seemed to have a history right on its surface. You could tell that it had lived. There was a story here to uncover. And as I got to know the people of Beaver County, I experienced in them the same thing I saw in the land, which is they just had stories to tell. They had lived lives. And there were some things about the people that struck me as similar to the landscape. They were tough. They had endured hardship, and they were coming through it, and still are coming through it. Beaver County is just behind in recovering from the crash of the steel industry, and so a lot of the towns are still building back kind of ordinary social and economic infrastructure. But the people were gracious and hospitable. They welcomed me, and they really would welcome anyone who sought to be among them as a neighbor, and I noticed that right from the start. Just a real warm welcome, and they kind of counted me as one of them, faster than I probably counted me as one of them. So Beaver County struck me with its beauty, really right from the start, and I felt at home here. And that was odd for my family, who came and thought, what alien landscape have we turned up in here? Yeah, it struck me with its beauty, and I really called this place home pretty quickly. And I really am so grateful to call Beaver County and my home, and those people my people, which they really have become. Sometime after college, I went to seminary. And you might ask why I went to seminary, and that's also a good question. I had a professor in college who told me that he noticed I was driven to think theologically. I was a writing and literature major. I really have always loved English, and I was hoping to go on to teach. That was my kind of career path. But this professor told me, you're driven to think theologically. You can't get away from thinking theologically. You should really consider going to seminary. And I put that on the back burner for a while, and I went and I did other things and coached volleyball and worked on a farm and got some life experience. But then when I was looking to apply to further school, I thought about world literature, and I applied to a bunch of programs there, but then I also applied to a few seminaries. I thought, why not? And what ended up happening is I didn't really want to move from where I was, and I went to the local seminary, which is in Ambridge, out in Beaver County. At this point, I had never really heard of Anglicanism, the Anglican tradition, the Episcopal Church. I didn't really know much about this tradition within the Protestant stream of the church. I was very confused about the church, in fact, because I had grown up Roman Catholic, gone to Geneva, experienced there, just a vast variety of Christian expressions. And I had graduated with a lot of confusion about what is the church and how do I find my place in it. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to go to seminary, because I wanted to learn, how have we arrived here? What's the story? How have we gotten here? And I was hungry to learn more about God. I have always been hungry to know about God. So I went to seminary, but my plan at seminary was still to graduate and then go on, hopefully for a PhD and go on to teach. That was my goal. While I was in seminary, though, I fell in love with the Episcopal tradition, with the prayer book, with the daily office, with the Eucharist. It was a kind of coming home for me as someone who grew up in the Roman Catholic Church and had a kind of a deep love for the reverence and the stability of the liturgy. Coming into the Episcopal tradition and recognizing there was this great beauty here, and it felt familiar, and it felt like coming home. So I joined the Episcopal Church while I was a student at seminary. Again, still with the plan to go on for my PhD and teach world literature. But while I was in seminary, I took a class on homiletics, on the study of preaching. And that was one of the first kind of turning points in seminary, because my first week of class, my professor was describing what is happening in the act of preaching. And I was kind of awestruck. I was hanging on her every word. What is happening in the act of preaching? She said, true preaching. Preaching that aligns with the preaching of the apostles and preaching that has been passed down through the ages. She said, the true preacher understands that the divine conversation between God and God's people is still happening. It's happening here and now, as the sermon is being preached. And God's goal in this divine conversation is always the same: to draw near to people with saving love through the person of Jesus Christ. I found tears were forming in my eyes as she was describing this, obviously because I wrote down every word she was saying. As she went on to describe the presence of Christ in the proclamation of the word, describing what it was to open the scriptures and then serve as a herald of good news to God's people. I had never heard anything so beautiful. Preachers must handle words, she said, with the same carefulness with which a priest handles the bread and the wine. Why? She went on. Because in preaching, as in the sacrament, Christ comes to us. I get chills just hearing that again. Christ comes to us. And as the tears streamed down my face in the middle of class, me and like 7 boys that were in my class, I realized that though I had been in churches my whole life, I had rarely experienced what she was describing. I had rarely experienced the power and the beauty and the goodness of this kind of preaching that she was describing to us. I fell in love with preaching while I was at seminary, and that was kind of the first flag that kind of went off in my head of, that's interesting, that's curious. It was about that same time, that I began to sense a gap in the spiritual landscape in Beaver County. I couldn't really articulate that gap yet, but I had been feeling it, and I started to feel it in a keener way while I was studying at seminary. And just a bit of context, because I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the history of the diocese, but there hasn't been an Episcopal church in Beaver County in nearly 20 years. So it's been a long stretch of there being a real absence there. I had joined the Episcopal Church, like I said, by that time, and I was commuting to the closest parish, which was over 30 minutes from my house. And I felt that distance. I still feel that distance. You know, I commute here, it's about 50 minutes when there's absolutely no traffic. It's an hour and 20 when there is. It's far away. And I really started to feel that then. I felt what a good thing it would be for my community that I loved, to have an Episcopal congregation. And I also felt what it would do for my own life, my own health, my own spiritual vitality, to have an Episcopal parish here. You probably won't be surprised, though I was, that it was around the same time I began personally discerning a call to the priesthood. So this was back in 2016-17. For the previous year and a half at seminary, there had been a number of people telling me I needed to consider this as a vocational pathway, that this was perhaps the way that God was leading me. And I kind of brushed that away for quite a while, month after month, saying, listen, I have no interest in joining the church in that capacity. I know the church is in shambles. I don't want to be a part of it in that way. I just can't see that. I'm going to be an English teacher. But I couldn't really escape the suggestion. And over the year that followed, as I meditated on the beauty of preaching, and as I thought about my own love, my deep love for the sacramental life of the church, I started to grow a little uneasy with my own answer to people. Maybe the work of the priests was the work that belonged to me. And almost as soon as I let myself think that thought, the question was there, as if it had been waiting for me all along, as if it had been waiting for the chance to ask, what if God is calling me in this next chapter to be a priest for this people, a priest to this place? Well, that question simmered for a while. I graduated from seminary in 2017. I worked for a few years in higher ed, and I was sorting out whether or not I would go overseas. That was the chapter of my life I was in then. I was actually discerning a call to serve in the church in Myanmar or in the Arctic, which are very different climates, you might notice. Totally different cultures and climates, but places I had spent time in that I felt very drawn to. The lives of Christians there are very difficult, and I was drawn to both of those places and was discerning a long-term commitment there. And then 2020 happened, and COVID hit, which helped me to discern I would stay right here. And there were plenty of reasons to stay here, in all seriousness. There are people I loved dearly who called me to life. There are my godchildren who I treasured. There are friends, family, and that strange wondering, that haunting curiosity. What if I was being called to be a priest to this people? Well, I started the ordination process. I had a few starts and stops along the way, but I'll go to the most recent rendition, which has successfully resulted in me being ordained, thanks be to God. I kind of started the ordination process 2020, and as I began that process of ordination, and there's a bunch of meetings and interviews and a lot of time to think, I meditated further on this gap that I was seeing in the spiritual landscape of Beaver County. And as I thought more about the spiritual needs here, I began to attempt to articulate what it was I was seeing. And the first thing I was seeing was a hunger for the historic expression of the faith, especially among young people. And what I mean by that is a practice of worship that doesn't seem like we came up with it last week. Yeah. That has a longevity, a felt age to it. That there's a passing down, a preserving of something happening here. And I experienced this hunger among my friends and community members, and again, especially among young people. People who maybe had grown up in churches that don't have a long tradition attached to them, and were feeling a hunger for something more stable. The second aspect, the second kind of need that I could start to articulate was a church that anyone could show up to. And I felt that in a deeply personal way, having been a student at Geneva College and seen that there were people who weren't able to find a place in the church. And maybe they did have a spiritual hunger, but for one reason or another, they were kind of pushed to the side or excluded. And I felt with a real seriousness that has lasted to this day that there needs to be a church that anyone can show up to, that anyone can come to and receive the good news of God in Christ. And when I say everyone, I want to just take a moment to say that I really do mean everyone. And I think that one of the real beauties of the Episcopal Church is its width, that there actually can be people who think remarkably differently about all sorts of things. And I love that. And I think that's what we're called to in the church. And especially in a culture where increasingly it's becoming impossible to disagree and still commune, the church is called to this. The church is called to be a witness that our unity is not a unity of ideology, it's union with a single person, Jesus. And because I'm bound to Jesus, and you're bound to Jesus, I'm bound to you. And there's no getting away from that. So I really believe that the church is called to this, and that's something that I started to be able to articulate, that there needed to be a church where everyone could show up to, and I really do mean everyone. And then lastly, there needed to be a church, another church, because of course there are absolutely churches that are preaching the gospel faithfully, but I felt the need for as many churches as can get out there that are really preaching Jesus. Let's have that happen. Because as I was describing earlier, I kind of fell in love with preaching in seminary. I was wooed, I was awestruck by this vision of preaching in which God truly comes to his people. I really felt like, man, let's proliferate that, because there's certainly plenty of other things happening from the pulpit. And I had experienced that, I've experienced that over the course of my life, and I know that many of you have as well. So these thoughts were maturing in me through the ordination process. And it was around that point that I started as a McNulty intern here. And over the course of my internship, really right from the beginning, I shared with Jonathon, this is kind of what I'm wondering about. This is what I'm thinking, pretty vague, pretty broad strokes. And Jonathon challenged me to get specific. And those were his words. Get specific. You have these broad pictures, these vague ideas, you have these curiosities. That's not going to get you very far. Start writing things down. Start getting to the details. And this was actually extremely helpful for me because I hadn't envisioned the details. I think in the ordination process, there's a sense of uncertainty about the future. So I had been afraid to imagine specifics, afraid to imagine the details. I didn't want to set myself up for disappointment or failure down the line. But Jonathon said, put that aside. That's in God's hands, and start envisioning the details. So he spent endless hours with me and with Kaylee talking about what could be in the future, asking questions, challenging me, getting me to rethink, to think in a clearer way, to write, to rework, to write again. Endless hours. So I do want to say thank you, Jonathon, because it was a huge help. Over the course of that time, we came up with a name. Church of the Incarnation. And Kaylee has just arrived, and I am going to give her a shout out here. Kaylee came up with the name. So credit where credit is due. We were on our way home from Calvary one day, and we were kind of being goofy, throwing out all sorts of funny names that the church could be called, and striking out, really, all over the place. And, and I said, really what I want to communicate is, in the name, is just how far God will go to be with us. And she said, Incarnation. And there was no conversation needed after that. That was it. That was obviously the name that it should be called, Church of the Incarnation. So that's how we came to that. And this is, I think, one word that summarizes exactly what I said. It's how far God will go to be with us. He comes to be with us in the flesh, comes to be with us in helplessness and sorrow and pain, comes to be with us even in death, so that we might be with God, which is the goal of everything. Over the kind of the second half of my McNulty internship, Calvary, as I began to share this more broadly, as Jonathon invited me to speak to the vestry and began speaking to parishioners about Incarnation, Calvary as a whole began discerning, we think we have a role in this. We think we have a place in this initiative, this effort, this project, this adventure. And what came from that, ultimately, was Calvary deciding that we want to be the parish that oversees Church of the Incarnation, which serves to nest the new congregation and provide the oversight, the kind of institutional support, the staff support, all those kinds of things for Incarnation. And so with that idea, we moved forward in faith toward my ordination, and of course I got ordained to the diaconate this past June. And we recognized that both the diocese and the bishop were enthusiastic about this project because it aligns very well with the diocese vision to start new Episcopal communities. This is one of the hopes of our bishop is for new Episcopal communities to grow. And so when this idea kind of came across the desk of these diocesan folks, there was a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of support. So we got the diocese blessing to go forward with this. And I know I've been talking a lot. I'm almost done, and then we're going to have some questions. But I want to talk a little bit about where we are now. So that was all history, kind of getting us to this point. But what are we up to now? Well, since my ordination and starting half-time as a curate here, I have been working with Calvary and with my community in Beaver County to spread the word. That's really the focus of our time right now, is sharing the vision and spreading the word. And when I talk about the vision for Incarnation, I really do highlight those three things that I mentioned earlier. The riches of an ancient faith, a place, a church that anyone can come to, where God's glorious welcome in Christ is offered, as it should be to all. And then a church that's going to preach Jesus week in and week out, that's going to continue that divine conversation in which God comes to his people. That's the vision I put forward when I talk with people about this. So right now we're seeking the initial group of lay people who will form Incarnation's core. And I'm having lots of conversations with people, lots of, trying to help people to discern, and truthfully to discern. I'm not trying to, this isn't a sales pitch. I'm not just trying to sell products. I really want people to discern if God is calling them to commit to this adventure with me. This real effort, because it will be an effort. This is going to be work to make it happen. But I think it's going to be work that pays back at our community in really, really rich ways. And then the other thing I'm doing is I'm starting the work of fundraising. Calvary, you probably know, Calvary has set aside $100,000 as part of the capital campaign to go toward the initial cost of Incarnation. And that money is what's helping to fund my curacy, in addition to the diocese paying a good portion of that. But that money is also going to be available for me to use. It's already been available for me to use on things like building a website and getting the kind of infrastructure that I need in place in order to make this vision a reality. It's also going to help with the initial costs of renting space when we start having events and meeting for prayer and all those kinds of things. So it's kind of the foundational seed money that's going to enable us to get started. But of course, there's going to be a lot more costs, and so I'm starting the work of fundraising. The path ahead, as far as how we're hoping to get from this chapter, which is focused on spreading the word, right, sharing the vision, how do we get from this chapter to actually meeting every week, right? That's the goal, right? Sharing in the weekly worship of the church. Well, my hope is that we start meeting for prayer, study, retreat, occasional Eucharistic worship in the spring. And that's going to be this coming spring, 2025. Those events are going to be irregular, intermittent. It's not going to be weekly. It's going to be, okay, we have a 6-week weekly course on X, or we have a 1-day retreat, you know. And the goal of those events is to enable people, is to provide a vehicle by which people can discern if they're called to this. And really just to give an introduction to people, because I think there will be some people who come as Episcopalians, and then I think there will be plenty of people who maybe have never heard of an Episcopalian and need an introduction to the Episcopal Church and to Incarnation and what we'll be about. So our hope is that these events will provide a real introduction to people so that they can, really try it on, you know. The events that, do we have a time where I meant to wear a watch? Perfect, thank you, great, we have plenty of time. The events that we currently have on the calendar, I'll just highlight them, but if you picked up a paper on your way in, or if you haven't, grab one on the way out, that website there has all of this information about the events and what we're up to and our timeline and all those things. So you can always check back if you're curious about more information. But the events we have currently scheduled are things like a course on the inheritance of the Christian faith. And the reason that I felt like it would be good and useful to talk about basically what does it mean to be a Christian is that's actually a pretty confusing question in our culture today. And I think it's worth tackling that straight on, right? If you ask 10 people on the street, what does it mean to be a Christian, you really might get 10 answers, 10 different answers. That's an incoherence that's evident to people. And I want to invite people into that, into acknowledging that confusion, and then describing the faith as an inheritance that we've passed through the ages that's glorious and rich and beautiful, and not the scary things that maybe are most upfront in our culture today. So we have that scheduled. We also have a retreat on the Episcopal tradition, ancient words and bodily worship. Again, just an introduction to what it is we're doing here and why we bow and cross ourselves and what on earth we're saying in the prayers, those kinds of things. It's going to invite people into the richness of our tradition. And then we're in the midst of scheduling other things and kind of deciding what's next and what's the right route here to take. So the goal is for us to be meeting, is to schedule these intermittent events so that they kind of lead us eventually to the spring of 2026, which is when we're hoping to be worshiping weekly, with weekly Eucharist, again, on Saturday evenings. Now, Calvary is the nesting parish for Incarnation. So this is how it's happening. The dream is becoming a reality. This is what we had envisioned is really taking shape. And so we all have a part to play in this. So you might be wondering, how can you participate or how can you help? And there's a few things I want to highlight in relation to that. First, I want to ask you to pray. And as a clergy person, I am bound to ask you to pray first, above all things. And I really mean that, though. I'm asking you with all sincerity, because this is a pretty hefty, pretty intimidating thing that's ahead of us. And Calvary this is truly going to be a communal effort, but at the same time, I'm the one heading the effort in Beaver County, and I would ask for your prayers specifically for me in this chapter. I'm feeling quite busy and quite overwhelmed. I do work a job in software still, and I'm eventually leaving that. That's the plan. But I need your prayers to sustain me in this chapter where my focus is in a lot of different directions, and there's really important work that needs to happen here. And then the second thing I would ask you specifically to pray for is for the people that God is calling to be a part of the core group of lay people that will form Incarnation's kind of foundational group. That those people would come to know about Incarnation, that it would be clear to them, that they would feel clear that this is something that I can commit to and I can be excited about. I just pray that I ask that you would pray that God would draw those people to this initiative. On the back of your little printout, there is a prayer that we're praying together. So if you want to put that on your fridge or on your nightstand, and just to remember Incarnation in prayer, that's just an easy way to do that. The second thing that you can do to participate is you can give of your money. Because like I said, we need funds for this initiative, and Calvary is already doing a great deal in providing for our initial costs. But my fundraising goal is bold, is to cover the first 5 years of our operating costs as a congregation. Now, the first 5 years of our operating costs are going to be quite a fraction of operating costs of something like Calvary, right? Because we're not going to own a building. Our plan is to rent from an existing congregation, most likely, at least for the first few years while we figure everything out. And we're going to just be a lot smaller, and like the span of what we're going to be trying to accomplish is a lot smaller. So it will be much less than the costs to maintain a parish like this, but it will still be somewhere between $500,000 and $800,000 to cover those first 5 years of the parish's life. So that's part of my goal. Why am I hoping that we can cover 5 years worth of expenses up front? I have been a part of small church communities, and maybe you have, where finances and the bottom line become the kind of driving factor around everything. And I think for the life of a new congregation that's forming, where the culture is forming, where everything is at its initial stage, it's so important that money be a very secondary consideration. And so while we're forming, I really don't want that to be a factor. I don't want it to be on people's minds. I don't want it to press stress into the congregation. I want us to be able to form and form well and form with health, and then we can start maturing into those different financial responsibilities in a new way. And once we're in the new year, past the stewardship campaign, there will be more to talk about with that, but we'll go on from there. All right, and then lastly, the last thing you can do to help is spread the word. So again, we're in the chapter right now of sharing the vision and spreading the word. And I really would ask that you think about who should know about this. Whether you know people in Beaver County, that's a major plus. If you know people in Beaver County, definitely tell them about it. But just who might want to be aware? Who might want to be involved? Who might want to pray about this? Who might want to give? Share the vision, spread the word. That's really going to help me, because my goal this year is for anyone who wants to be a part of it, that they know about it. That's one of my major goals for this coming year. Okay, that is all I have to share. So we'll move on now to just questions and discussion and more of a conversation. Did you have a question?
No, I totally applaud what you're doing, and I'd be happy to be a part of it as moved. Practical question, how are you identifying, how have you and how are you identifying potential parishioners? Are they disaffected members of Trinity, the Anglican Church that's there now?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Reframe the question.
Yes. The question was, how am I identifying potential parishioners? Is it folks who, don't have an Episcopal church anymore because it's shut down, or those kinds of things? That's a great question. So a variety of ways. I'm identifying potential parishioners in a variety of ways, but largely it's people that over the years I've seen are drawn to this way of worshiping and maybe are in another church or maybe aren't in a church at all because they've been either kind of pushed out or they just have found themselves church homeless for one reason or another. So I'm talking to a lot of those folks. And then I am connecting with Episcopalians that I know are in Beaver County who are either commuting or haven't been to church in a while because they don't have a spiritual home out there. So a number of different ways. I am connecting with those folks that you mentioned though. Yep.
Sorry, I didn't hear the last sentence.
I am connecting with those folks who are Episcopalians and may have, not have a spiritual home. Yeah.
So obviously Calvary is part of a community of faith in the East End and beyond.
Yeah.
Do you feel that there is the same type of community of faith in Beaver County that you can rely on to support Church of Incarnation?
Yeah, so the question was, Calvary is a part of a community of faith here a larger community of faith here in Shadyside and the East End, and do I foresee that kind of support in Beaver County? That's an interesting question. It's actually something I think I'm exploring right now. I have not been going to church in Beaver County in quite some time, so I'm like reacquainting myself with the spiritual landscape and seeing what openness there might be to relationships across different Christian denominations, across different religious communities. I'm in the midst of exploring that right now. So once a month, I'm in Beaver County right now working there, and during those days, I pack my days with meetings with pastors and different spiritual leaders, trying to just get a sense of, what's the landscape there? Good question. Yeah.
What you said has raised two questions for me, both of which have been partly addressed by the previous questions. One question, you talk about a hunger for a traditional ancient form of faith. Well, Roman Catholicism has been around for even longer
Absolutely.
than Anglicanism. In what ways do you feel that there are people there who might not be being served by
Yeah.
Roman Catholicism who are potential parishioners? And the other question I'd like to hear more about is, you say there was an Episcopal church there 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
What happened to it?
Sure.
What was there a building that they could not
Yeah.
sustain, or were they renting? Could you go into a little more detail about why the previous Episcopal church could not sustain itself?
Sure, so there were two questions. The first one was, I talk about the riches of an ancient faith. The Catholic Church is around in Beaver County, so what's the use for an Episcopal church? That was the first question. I'll tackle that one first. So, as someone who grew up in the Roman Catholic Church, I actually have a deep respect for the Roman Catholic Church, and I know that people have very different experiences growing up in Catholicism. I had a really rich and beautiful experience. So I have a great respect for the Roman Catholic Church. I just know that not everyone's going to be able to find a home there. And that's for a lot of different reasons, whether it's just hurt over things that have happened in recent years, or whether it's because, maybe they're divorced or they're gay or something like that. So there is a sense that there are people who can't find a home there, and that's, I think, those are the folks that I'm wondering about for something like Incarnation. And then the second question was, what happened to the Episcopal churches in Beaver County? So you may be aware there was a split in the Episcopal Church in America back in the early 2000s. And the Episcopal churches that were a part of the Episcopal Diocese of Pittsburgh all joined the ACNA, which was that new movement. And since then, unfortunately, a lot of them have closed down. So there's actually only a handful of congregations out in Beaver County that are part of the Anglican Church in North America, and they're struggling a little bit. So they're not flourishing in the ways that the church was, some years ago. And so that's the story with the Episcopal churches. Yes.
Adding from been here slightly longer diocesan perspective, that particular congregation, the Episcopal Church in Beaver County, left the Episcopal Church and went to the ACNA, or sometimes called ACNA. They folded, and then the building was sold. And that building, the proceeds from it, I think it's approximately 200 some odd thousand. Anybody know? Diocesan people know? 200,000 something. that is supposed to be set aside for future ministry in Beaver County. It would be wonderful if we could eventually tap into that money specifically for Episcopal or, I believe, ACNA ministry in Beaver County. That would be a future thing for us to consider.
Excuse me, there is an existing Anglican church in Beaver County right now.
Yes, yes. There are 2 or 3 across Beaver County. Yep.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Where are you getting your strategic vision from? Like, is there guidance on how to plant a church, or there are other out there?
What a great question. Where are we getting our strategic vision from? Is there guidance about how to plant a church? You know, what steps to take, those kinds of things. There is so much guidance across the kind of church world about how to plant a church, though, a lot of it goes in contradicting directions. I would say in the Episcopal Church, church planting new churches hasn't been a strength of ours in recent years. But Calvary actually has a rich history of planting churches. It's just been a little while since we've done that.
Calvary's planted 5. Any guess to what those 5 churches are?
Those ones.
St. Paul's, Mount Lebanon, St. Stephen's, Wilkinsburg. I think Ascension is one. It was a normal thing, and the way that we did that, for very, very briefly, for most of the Episcopal Church's history, to start a new church, it would be an existing congregation, like Calvary, like St. Paul's, whatever, would see a new area, and then they would send the curate to that new area, and back in the day, he would have held, St. Stephen's, the first services were held in a laundry. It could be in a school, it could be in some type of public building, and they would do some type of Sunday school usually and worship, and then we would send that priest go out and become the vicar or head priest of that new congregation. That was normal and was largely successful. We carried that model through the 1950s to the 1960s. And then for whatever reason, we decided, oh no, we're Episcopal. That should come from the diocesan structure. And without making value judgments, I will observe that we've been horribly inefficient, horribly unsuccessful at planting churches since that time. So I would just say there are a lot of, too many cooks in the kitchen sometimes messes things up. And so I've started a church successfully before within a congregation. Deanna's done lots of the research. I've been reading about this for 25 years. So we're, of course, want to learn from every possible source, but I also know what works and what works in Lutheran and other traditions, in addition to just our own. So a lot of the strategic planning is Deanna and I praying and then bringing in other people. It generally works when you have we've used the term nesting. Let me be very specific about that. So rather than trying to come up with a brand new vestry, our vestry is the vestry. Rather than trying to come up with, here's something that you wouldn't think of. If Deanna wants to stream a service and has any music, that music you have to have a license or they will shut you down. And if you want to print any music, that's a separate license. Those are $500 each. They would be within Calvary, so that's $1,000 a year that they don't have to spend. And then printing cost and all these other type things, communications, all that infrastructure or other staff time is something we can do that's already part of our system that's really, quite frankly, pretty easy for us. Or here's another one, doing the books, trying to write checks or get reimbursements. If you had to do that separately on your own, addition would be very, very complicated, even counting the money. And so our bookkeeper is able to do all those things. There's a separate bank account for Incarnation. It was created a week or 2 ago. So all that money will be audited just like the rest, but segregated, as in from the Calvary front, segregated. In 5 years, that's a good guess. If they're so richly blessed, oh my gosh, thousands of people show up.
Amen.
Kind of like what I'd like to be taken care of in my old age. Maybe they could hire me as an assistant. But the idea would be if in 5 years, we're doing really well, we're going to rent our own building, that we would be able to just give them from that checking account, here's your money, and you have your separate, become incorporated, become a new congregation, wonderful. If they need to stay in the nest a little bit longer, okay, when they're ready to fly on their own. Something that I'm pretty good at logistics. So Deanna and I figured out, one, you need a budget for startup cost, computer, website, phone, video camera, tripod, streaming service, so on. Then you need a budget, annual budget for what do you do when you're nested within Calvary, so we don't have to pay all these other things. And then you need another annual budget for if we're on our own. And so those are trying to think to let them go off to successful life, not without us, but doing it themselves, and then we'd still be in relationship. I would say what has been a wonderful part for me the whole time is I would love for Deanna to stay forever, but also, you want your kids to grow up and move out of the house eventually, and that's the case, but that she would still be here on Sundays, not forever, but for quite many years, to continue that relationship and that connection. Well, what other questions do you have?
Yes.
Bit of a shot in the dark, but it's going through my mind as I was involved in the Board of Trustees, standing committee after we split. A lot of parishes left. A lot of buildings were left empty, and they've been sold over the years. I don't even know if there are any still up. Along with those buildings and the parishes themselves, there were probably across that group hundreds of prayer books and hymnals that were no longer needed or wanted. I frankly don't know what became of them. Maybe they all went.
They're in the diocesan archives, mostly.
Well, there may be some free
Totally.
prayer books and hymnals that you can access. That would be a great way to start, because otherwise you've got to buy them from church publishing.
Yep.
They'll be a little bit used, maybe a lot used, but guess what?
Yeah.
They're probably in decent enough shape.
For sure, yeah, and yeah, just mentioning that there's resources from these previous sales of buildings and where churches have shut down that we can maybe take advantage of, totally. It is 5 to 11.
Any last questions?
And also, I just want to note that feel free to reach out to me or email me if you want to chat further, if you have other questions. I'm happy to talk about this. This is what I'm doing. I want to be talking about this with people. So feel free to reach out if you want to meet up and chat further about this. But you're definitely going to be hearing more about it as the months go on.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.